Hi again everyone. Today I'd like to talk about a very important topic, trans rights, and specifically ask the question, are trans people a danger to cis people in gendered spaces? Or, as it's usually framed, are trans women a threat to cis women in women's spaces? So, the answer to both these questions is no. Wow, that was quick. Guess we're done here. Bye! Okay, so while that answer should be obvious, to some people it's not. So I'm going to do a bit more work here. Now, if you've been living under a rock recently and don't have any idea of the wider arguments around trans issues, then I'm sorry, I'm not going to give you a full exploration of what it is to be transgender, or a full defense of every argument that gets made against the trans community. If you're that unfamiliar with the arguments, there is a bunch of links in the description to videos which cover it, and there's tons more online. Mostly by people far better placed and qualified to talk about it than me, as I am a cis man, and so I'm limited in what I can add to the discourse on this sort of oppression, as I have no material experience of the conditions of trans people from my own perspective. So there's plenty of actual trans and non-binary people you can hear this stuff from. I'm showing and have shown some on the screen now, and you should totally go do that. They are very important voices to hear and far more qualified to talk about it than me. So what have I got to offer? Well, I wanted to do a quick explainer on a couple of aspects of this debate which I haven't seen covered on YouTube yet, though I'm sure someone may have done this and I've missed it. The main reason for this is because it relates to some recent events, and to a pretty recent study, but one which provides what seems to me to be one of the final pieces of evidence for a complete research-based refutation of anti-trans arguments. By the way, I'm not saying that only research-based arguments are significant here. Listening to arguments relating to experiences of trans people can also give full refutations of these arguments, and it's always important to listen to their voices on these issues. But study-based evidence is a good angle for someone like myself, a cis man, to approach it, because it allows me to make statements with a strong basis, and with less risk of misrepresenting the materiality of trans existence. I can't and shouldn't be telling you how trans people feel, when they can do it a lot better themselves. I can, however, read a study and report the results, and thereby use what little platform I have to support their cause. So, I'd better get the appropriate colours on, and maybe a little bit of bylighting? Well, sort of. And let's get on with it. So in the field of objectively testable notions around trans people, there are a few well-worn discussions which have pretty much already been sorted by science and academia, though that doesn't seem to stop people coming back to them to tread over them again and again. Arguments like, there's only two genders, I learned it in high school biology, often accompanied by some rant about chromosomes, which is well documented to be bullshit based on misleading simplifications, which are not supported by the current state of science. Or, leading on from that, the idea that a trans man or trans woman can never be truly a man or woman. This is especially used against trans women to claim they are just men in dresses who are likely to get violent and abuse women. This argument has recently been undermined in some very interesting studies in neuroscience. I will link to articles about these studies, and those that disprove all the other points here, in the description. These arguments also include claims that allowing very young trans people to transition, or at least to block puberty to gain some time to decide before certain irreversible gendered changes take place in their body, is in some way harmful, which again does not align with our current research. Or even trans inclusion being a bad thing in sport, which seems fairly peripheral when these arguments really are about the existence of an oppressed minority, but it is often an argument used by transphobes, and again, there's a lot of evidence to show why it's not a good argument. I'd like to emphasise here that most of these arguments are most often deployed against trans women specifically. There is obviously huge amounts of bigotry and stigma towards trans men and non-binary people of all stripes in our society, but there is a certain special vitriol for trans women, who are seen by some men as a sort of trick to make them gay or something. Contrapoints did a really interesting video on this, which you should all watch if you haven't. And by some women as male invaders or gender colonialists. This view is especially prominent amongst some second-wave feminists, known as trans-exclusionary radical feminists, or TERFs, some of whom even otherwise identify as being on the left, but I'll come to that later. Of course, this view doesn't let trans men and non-binary people off the hook for oppression, but imposes a different oppression by making them and their issues less visible in the public sphere. Now, as I say, most of the arguments from these people that are objectively testable have generally been tested and the anti-trans arguments disproved, but there's one that seems to have kept rearing its head, especially recently, as the discussion around inclusion of trans people in spaces relating to their assigned gender has become prominent in response to various laws to promote or prevent them doing so, and of course the Gender Recognition Act in the UK. This is the idea that trans people, or specifically trans women in most formulations, are a danger to cis people, again generally specifically women, in gendered or women's spaces, like toilets, changing rooms and so on. Now, this has been disproved in many ways before, experientially by highlighting the ridiculousness of people who clearly appear as one gender using a bathroom assigned to the other just because that's how they were born, or the nonsense of the idea that anyone would be checking birth certificates or genitals at bathroom and changing room doors, or when you're sitting in a cubicle. It has also regularly been disproved logically. Assaults in bathrooms are currently illegal, and no one checks the birth gender of those who go in generally anyway. Any assault that could happen in these spaces through people dressing as the opposite gender can already happen, and are already fully prosecutable. So allowing trans people into these spaces at law would make no difference to the likelihood of these events or the ability of the law to respond. Therefore, bills to force trans people to use their birth-gendered spaces, like North Carolina's HB2, merely create an incredibly complicated social labyrinth for trans people, which may in many cases effectively exclude them from gendered public spaces like bathrooms, as they may feel unsafe to enter either gender's assigned space. Obviously, gender-neutral bathrooms are also used in many places without incident, and should probably be used in more. So, this argument is as ridiculous as most of the arguments levelled against trans people, but it is often made and remade and backed up with anecdotal evidence, often using spurious or misleading examples, or allusions to the existence of supposed examples which are never actually stated, probably because they wouldn't hold water, to try and give it an air of objectivity. However, many of even their smattering of heavily overused cases don't stand up to scrutiny, often turning out to be basically irrelevant, like a cis man who installed a camera in a unisex bathroom, which was used as an example against trans people in these spaces by Sarah Dittam on Channel 4's ill-advised Genderquake debate show, which resulted in Munro Bergdorf being subject to horrific transphobic statements shouted by audience members. I would show a clip of Dittam's argument to illustrate this here, but it doesn't seem to be available anywhere. Only a few small clips exist on YouTube, and even Channel 4 don't seem to have the whole debate up anymore. Maybe even they are ashamed of it now. Further, these individual cases, even if valid, which I have yet to see one which was, don't necessarily point to any pattern or correlation, negative or positive, around trans inclusion in gendered spaces. One case does not a statistical trend make, but we'll get to the statistics in a moment. So again, I want to be clear, these arguments are all ones which already have responses. I'm not claiming to have proved these arguments wrong for the first time here, or to be making great new strides in trans defence. Lots of people have already done this. However, the power of anecdotes to mislead can be strong, using fear to try and prevent us seeing the general common sense of trans inclusion. However, we do now have an objective study to disprove this shit. Gender Identity Non-Discrimination Laws in Public Accommodations, a review of evidence regarding safety and privacy in public restrooms, locker rooms and changing rooms by Amira Hassenbush, Andrew Flores and Jodie Herman, is a mouthful to say, and it's also a 2018 study which looks at the rates of crimes committed in inclusive and non-inclusive gendered spaces, in a direct attempt to find an objective answer to the question of whether trans inclusion presents a risk of increased crime in these spaces. The TLDR of all this is they concluded that this study finds that the passage of such laws is not related to the number or frequency of criminal incidents in these spaces. Additionally, the study finds that reports of privacy and safety violations in public restrooms, locker rooms and changing rooms are exceedingly rare. This study provides evidence that fears of increased safety and privacy violations as a result of non-discrimination laws are not empirically grounded. Now, when they say exceedingly rare, note that the data they got from police did not note whether the accused or victims were trans or cisgendered, or whether they falsely presented their gender to access the space. So this exceeding rarity is for all crime in these spaces, implying that transgender crimes, or crimes by those falsely presenting their gender to access the spaces, given their small proportion of the population, would be expected to be a tiny fraction of this already tiny number. Of course, if these laws did increase rates, even a few assaults are a bad thing, but, as it points out in the above quote, there is no empirical reason to believe that they do, and no logical reason either, as we discussed earlier. Also, by the same token, a certain number of victims may themselves be transgender, and there may in fact be logical reason to think that laws prohibiting trans people from the gendered spaces that they present as belonging in may increase victimization of them as a group. The study here even notes in the discussion that a 2008 poll of 93 trans people in Washington DC showed 9% reported being attacked in bathrooms. This is a small sample size, but it gives reason to believe that trans people do in fact have a much greater risk of attack in these spaces, making it all the more ironic and frankly disgusting that some try and portray trans people as an inherent threat in these spaces, and not at risk of being victims. But anyway, the conclusion I quoted above seems pretty clear, but in case you're still unconvinced by that, and also just because it's interesting, let's have a look at how they actually came to that conclusion. So the study is explicitly seeking to find whether reports of safety or privacy violations in public restrooms, locker rooms, and dressing rooms change in frequency in localities that have gender identity inclusive public accommodations non-discrimination ordinances, or JAPANDOs, as compared to matched localities without JAPANDOs. The research was carried out in Massachusetts because, for a period of time, Massachusetts had a statewide non-discrimination law that was inclusive of gender identity in employment and housing, but not public accommodations. Thus, these conditions created an optimal context in which to compare rates of public restroom privacy and safety incidents in localities that had passed local JAPANDOs with matched localities that had not. Some individual localities within Massachusetts expanded upon state law by incorporating explicit gender identity protections in public accommodation laws, which includes protections in public restrooms, locker rooms, and changing rooms. This allowed for a between-locality study, comparing localities that had passed JAPANDOs with matched localities within the state that did not have JAPANDOs, but otherwise had gender identity non-discrimination protections in employment, housing, credit, and services. The matched pairs strategy means that the distinguishing factor between those localities is the existence or absence of a public accommodation-specific non-discrimination law that applied to gender identity. So, they chose Massachusetts because of its split system of non-discrimination, with inclusive spaces in employment and housing, but not public accommodations, such as public restrooms, changing rooms, or locker rooms. However, some localities had expanded on this by introducing public accommodations protection, or JAPANDOs. This allowed the researchers to make matched pairs of very similar localities where the distinguishing factor was specifically trans inclusion in these public accommodations, and where other social factors and other factors relating to trans inclusion were equal, allowing as fair a comparison of localities as possible. They also noticed that some places had partial JAPANDOs, with limitations including things like exclusions for restrooms, or situations where rules were in place but either had no or an unclear enforcement provision. They therefore did a second pair of matched pairs, matching the original districts with full JAPANDOs with districts with partial JAPANDOs, to provide a second check on the accuracy of the results and to avoid placebo effects. They also note that in 2016, Massachusetts introduced a statewide bill to allow trans inclusion in public accommodations. However, their data does not cover this period. However, the importance of this debate in Massachusetts is still highlighted by the fact that in 2018, a petition brought forth a repeal vote for the trans-inclusive policies, although this was, thankfully, unsuccessful at the ballot box. So anyway, the researchers looked at the comparative reported crime rates in these matched pairs of localities distinguished only by the fact that, at the time, one of the pair was inclusive in public accommodations, and the other was not. So to begin with, they compared reported crime rates in the areas with JAPANDOs for both before and after the passage of the JAPANDOs, and compared the figures to the equivalent data for their matched pairs with no JAPANDOs. Here's the results. So they found there were in fact fewer annual incidents in area with clear JAPANDOs against their matched pairs, but also that there was no significant change in rates of incidents in either category between the periods before and after passage of the JAPANDOs. This led them to conclude that there was no statistically significant relationship between JAPANDO policy passage and victimization. When this test was repeated, including the additional partial JAPANDO matches, the results continued to show no significant relationship. Here they are. Now to be clear, This is saying there is no link statistically between transgender protections in gendered spaces and rates of crime in those spaces. So there you go. Inclusion bills in gendered public spaces do not present a risk. But what about more sensitive gendered spaces? Many of the anti-trans arguments do go further than bathrooms and changing rooms to look at more sensitive spaces like hospitals and prisons. So let's take the argument at its strongest. Do trans people, and especially trans women, because again they tend to bear the brunt of this critique, pose an extra risk if placed by their gender identity in prison? This argument's been particularly messy here in the UK recently, with claims by many trans exclusionary groups that British child murderer Ian Huntley was attempting to transition in prison, a claim that turned out to be entirely false, and for which British tabloids like the Daily Star have had to print retractions recently because it was literally completely made up, as confirmed by Huntley himself. But putting aside this outright lie, usually the perceived threat of trans women, and let's face it, again, it's generally trans women who are attacked in this way, is bound up with a series of individual cases held up as examples as though they alone prove the case. There are a few of these about, but still only a thin smattering. And though we don't have statistics on the rate of trans on cis violence in prison, or at least not as far as I can find, if these cases are true, there is little reason to believe they represent a disproportionate percentage of the violence in prisons. Certainly, the above study shows that trans people do not offer an above-average threat in other gendered spaces, so while prisons are very different, it wouldn't be that surprising if this trend continued there. The trans exclusionary argument here envisions trans people as basically unreconstructed men who call themselves women, and asks us to imagine them with strong, muscular physiques and stereotyped male aggression, which is a ridiculous straw man which represents few trans people, as well as seeming to have a general ignorance of hormone treatment and its effect. However, even if certain prisoners, like the spurious Ian Huntley example, posed a specific threat in the way implied, above that of the average prisoner in the facility, there are generally already systems in place to deal with that. Prisons have more and less dangerous inmates anyway, whether trans or not. More violent prisoners are often separated, and there is an enforcement regime which, theoretically, is meant to protect prisoners. Now I want to be clear here, I don't support prisons or think that these are effective methods. I think prisons are damaging institutions which fail to serve the functions of deterrence or of rehabilitation on which they are justified, and that if we want to sort out the problems of our society, one thing we will have to do is try and move away from prisons and punitive and carceral punishment towards more reparative forms of justice. But my point here is that trans people exist now in a pre-abolitionist society, and so do prisons, and so trans people will end up in prison. So we do need to work to make sure they don't receive additional harm due to their minority status. And insofar as prisons can be said to ensure anyone's safety, they can already use existing policies if it did turn out that a specific trans prisoner was a particular threat to the rest of the population. But few trans people are actually the muscle-bound, barely reconstructed masculine body envisioned by the bigots who peddle this narrative, and if we look at what data we do have on trans people in prisons, much of it seems to point to the fact that trans people in prison are far more likely to be the victims than the perpetrators of assaults. And this risk is much greater if they are placed in a prison which does not match their gender identity. According to the National Center for Transgender Equality, trans women in California sent to male prisons were 13 times more likely to be sexually assaulted than male prisoners in the same facilities. And according to Sexton, Janess and Sumner, 2010, estimates of transgender individuals in the prison community who have had suicidal ideation or who have attempted suicide range from 30% to over 50%. And they cite some other studies here from which they sourced these statistics. I mean, really, it's not hard to imagine. As I mentioned earlier, many people have noted in response to bathroom bills how going into the bathroom of their birth gender creates serious problems. We can only imagine how much this effect is amplified in the much more severe prison environment. So, though we haven't had a study such as the one I looked at for bathrooms earlier for prisons, the indications seem to be pretty strong that looking at the impact of transgender prisoners on other inmates is far less significant an issue than looking at the impact of prisons, and especially being misgendered by the prison system, on trans people. This is particularly significant at the moment, as the UK government has been moving some trans women into men's prisons ahead of an as yet unclear new policy. But though this policy is still unclear, it doesn't seem like a good sign when it involves transgender women being moved into male prisons. All of this being said, while we must protect transgender rights in prison, while we still have them, I still feel that prisons have massively negative psychological and health impacts on all people, and never actually reduce crime. So the real solution to this problem here is ending prisons. But that's an argument I will save for another video. Incidentally, while we are talking about trans rights and research, there was another story I noticed on this recently. On February the 10th, 2019, the UK newspaper The Sunday Times claimed a psychological research student had been denied the right to study transition surgery regret rates at Bath Spa University because it was, I quote, politically incorrect. The student himself apparently claimed that this was a free speech issue. What a surprise. But of course, this is actually bollocks. First, as the Times article itself even quotes, the university explained why this research was dropped very clearly. His research proposal was not refused because of the subject matter, but because of his proposed methodological approach. The university was not satisfied this approach would guarantee the anonymity of his participants or the confidentiality of data. So, this wasn't suppression of his free speech for the sake of political correctness. It was an attempt to protect the rights to privacy of the participants. It was to protect the very people who regret their transition that this study was apparently so concerned with. The second reason his claim that this is a free speech issue is bollocks is that studies on this subject are not repressed. It's not like he was a lone voice hoping to look at an unexplored topic. There have been a number of studies into regret rates on transition surgery. From just a couple of articles cited in the description, we can see that several studies have concluded the pretty small regret rate of 2 to 2.2%. But this rate seems to be quite a broad category of regret, and to include people who have some regrets but don't seem to decide to reverse it, as estimates for actual surgical reversal rates of people who've had transition surgery are around 0.13 to 0.2%, so less than 10% of those with some regrets. Regardless, for such a massive life decision, this seems to be a pretty low regret rate all round. Certainly in terms of major life decisions that you can later change your mind about, it's a much lower regret rate than, say, divorce. But these people aren't questioning the validity of marriage because it can be damaging and is a life choice some people regret and choose to reverse. The Times article also claims that the demand for reversal surgery is increasing, clearly trying to imply that many trans people were taken in by some sort of recent fad or something and are now rushing to reverse it. But the evidence does not support this increase going beyond being proportional to the increase in transition surgeries in general. 0.13 to 0.2% of a bigger number would be an increase in demand, but not an increase of regret proportional to the growth of the trans population, and the trans population has been growing quickly. But the rise in transitions is not some fad. It's not a fashion craze. It is a product of a massively increased amount of information available on the topic, allowing millions of people to finally have the language to describe their own lived experiences, and the support to follow through with their needs. And frankly, as a cis man, I think that is a beautiful thing. So, like so many other bigoted arguments, under close examination these anti-trans claims pretty well dissolve into the use of caricatures and smear campaigns to denigrate a threatened minority. Now this is not new. The tarring of people of colour, migrants, or other minorities by over-reporting their crimes, for example, is a tactic used by bigots from Hitler to Trump, and of course by many pressure groups like Migration Watch UK. And this is much like how transgender violence in prison is often reported, while most everyday prison violence remains unexamined in the public sphere, creating a false impression of its frequency compared to the general population. Similarly, arguments around bathrooms and changing rooms around trans people mirror almost exactly the classic baseless heterosexual anxieties, common in the past, and unfortunately still used as a punchline by many, about sharing toilets with queer people. Now, this isn't really a surprise on the right. Bigotry's kinda their vibe, but, as I mentioned above, anti-trans bigotry seems to have some purchase on the nominal left. This too, however, does reflect a dark past. Socially conservative politics do have a history on the left. Many so-called socialists in the past, for example, described homosexuality as a bourgeois deviation, and actively repressed this. This was certainly Soviet policy under Stalin. Not that I'm saying the Soviet Union or Stalin represent any decent thinking person's vision of socialism, but it was also on the books for many Western socialist groups, from the US Communist Party of the 1950s to the Labour militant sect in the UK up until the 1980s. Today, thankfully, this position would be untenable for any left group as a public platform, and rightly so, and And while obviously, like any other space, the left is not completely free of homophobia or other bigotries, bourgeois deviation theory has been relegated to a skeleton in the closet of leftist history. Any revolution or socialist action at the expense of minorities is in itself incomplete, and by the same token, the equality of minorities cannot be complete without a completed socialist project. This was highlighted in the case of women in the 1960s through the rallying cry, "There will be no women's liberation without revolution, and there will be no revolution without women's liberation." In the past, some sections of the supposed left have embraced homophobia, misogyny, and even racism, and we should remember that all these things were present just in the Soviet Union. And to me, this is in direct conflict with the universal egalitarian aims of the socialist cause. But again, today, it's clear to the vast majority of us that these reactionary social stances of the past were a mistake. Okay, some people do seem to carry on with it, but we don't have to talk about them right now. Overall, it still puzzles and disgusts me that some on the left can't join the dots and learn from our past mistakes. Bourgeois deviation theory was a nonsense that caused our movement to alienate and harm queer people, even working class queer people, who were under threat and who we should have been allying with and protecting. As many leftist groups did, by the way, and certainly these were never bigotries that permeated the whole left. Just as many cis leftists today are not transphobes, and what better to point out as an example of that than H-Bomber Guy's recent amazing Donkey Kong charity livestream for trans children's charity Mermaids. This is one of millions of examples, but, well, I wanted an excuse to mention it, and it was fantastic. Also, due to the fact it was directed against comedy writer turned professional internet transphobe Graham Linehan for his horrific attempt to block Mermaids from receiving lottery funding, which incidentally failed and they got the money, it was very briefly listed on Wikipedia under the definition of owned, which is hilarious, and well done to H-Bomber Guy for that, and everyone else involved. Anyway, back to the point. The exclusionary debate around trans people from TERFs who identify as left is just as wrong and has just the same effects as bourgeois deviation theory did in the past. It polices the limits of class and gender to uphold socially conservative norms, it prevents us from protecting certain marginalised groups and causes, and those who endorse it intensify and reinforce the marginalisation of that minority. This is not socialism. This is not a left discourse, no matter if the people spreading it identify as left or not. As it happens, gender is something you can identify as and be sole arbiter of, as it relates to your own internal world. Leftism isn't. Leftism has an ideology and standards and policies designed to affect the external world. It is about equality, and if your version of leftism excludes trans people from that equality, this is not consistent with a leftist desire for equality, and effectively leaves you using feminism and class politics to cloak your bigotry, which doubles down on the oppression of one of the most vulnerable groups in our society. So let's be loud and clear, and show we can learn from the mistakes of the past, and we do know what we need for the future. No revolution without trans rights, just as there can be no revolution without rights for women, or for people of colour, or for any other oppressed minority. And it is always important to remember this, not just for the people in these oppressed minorities, but for us as well, because together we are stronger. So thanks for watching, everyone. I've tried to cover this topic in a sensitive way. Well, not really sensitive to transphobes, but I have aimed to keep this video as sensitive as possible to the trans and non-binary communities, and I really hope I've managed to do that. If you think there's something I've got wrong, I'm very open to criticism on this, so please let me know in the comments below. On that note, I'd like to thank the few people who read over the script to try and make sure that I kept it as appropriate as possible. Among them, the wonderful trans YouTuber Mia Mulder, and also one of my fantastic patrons, Gestin. Very kindly read the script for me and recommended any changes they thought were needed. So thank you very much to you guys. So anyway, if you've enjoyed this video or others on my channel, why not like it, share it, and subscribe to the channel? And if you really like these videos and you have enough money to do so, why not donate me $1 or so on Patreon to help me make more of these videos in the future? And on that note, I'd like to thank my current patrons: Emily Dickinson, Carly, Natty, Zabezian, A Wingless Monkey, Baffy, Brett Long, Daniel Stenson, Das Martin, Emu Al, Gestin, Jason Rajamogan, Rory Cunningham, Sinead Kerwin, The Cooler Noah, and Thoughtslime. An extra special thanks to George Soros and Peter Benzoni. So a massive thanks to all my patrons, I'm eternally grateful. I'd also like to give a massive shout out and thanks to Bathymetric Studios who made the music you have been hearing underneath this video. It's the first time I've used music and they've given me a wonderful track, so thanks Bathymetrics, you're awesome. And as always I'd like to thank Blue Legenda for doing the animations and original graphics for this video. And just to finish off, if you want a little bit of gossip, I saw on Twitter recently that Graham Linehan, the comedy writer turned internet transphobe I mentioned earlier, but of course you all know who he is by now, recently posted a thread effectively asking how people got into transphobic feminisms, prompting some very weird and uncomfortable stories. But most notably, he gave his own account, and it turns out that by his account, genuinely one of the major factors in making him a transphobic personality was the backlash he received from the trans community for his really transphobic episode of the IT Crowd. So basically, he spent a decade trolling an entire community because he was butthurt that people pointed out the offensive elements in one of his TV shows. Anyway, I just thought that was a little tidbit to show what a sad, strange man Graham Linehan is. And of course it's a special bonus for any of you who listened through all of those credits there. So, thanks very much for listening, and I'll see you next time. Bye!